My name is Nick Petrolini. On the line with me is Jerry Taylor, our solution consultant, who will take you through the demo portion of MEM for Business Central today. The agenda today, so we'll talk a bit about binary stream, and then we'll get into a little bit of an overview of multi-entity management for Business Central, and then we'll turn things over to Jerry, who will actually take you through the demo of the solution within Business Central and show you how it looks in practice. Yeah, so getting into a bit about binary stream, as some of you probably know, we've been around for over 20 years now. And, over that time, we've been able to maintain our standard as a Microsoft Gold partner, as well as be ranked in that President's Club in the top 5% of Microsoft partners for a number of years. And this year, we're particularly proud of being able to say that we were a finalist for Microsoft Partner of the Year Awards. So that's something we're pretty proud of, and we just learned about that over the last couple of weeks or so. And then the timeline you'll see at the end there as well is one of the more exciting things that we've been able to share recently. We've been able to land a licensing agreement with Microsoft, who will be licensing our subscription billing solution, which we'll have a lunch and learn for that next week, I believe. But now getting into solutions. So these are the three major solutions that we've ported over to the D365 base at this point, with our subscription billing suite, of course, and property lease management, which is now available in finance and SCM, but is in the process of being ported over to Business Central today. And that's scheduled for sometime in Q4 of 2021 this year. So that's an exciting thing on the horizon there. But today, of course, is going to be mainly focused around multi-entity management and how we can offer that in Business Central now today, and be able to show you some of that functionality as well. Some of the target verticals that MEM is a great fit for. On the list here, you'll see, the main theme is really anything with multiple locations and that can grow and add locations in a heartbeat, or have to terminate locations along the way and have to adjust that organizational structure. MEM is really meant to be more of a horizontal solution that will fit any company that has a need to manage multiple entities within D365, and keep that user security and keep everything locked down but available all within that one instance or that one tenant in Business Central, and have that more simplified and streamlined. So here are some of the verticals that we've had success in the past, and some that we continue to focus on moving forward. And then just a basic rundown of some of the functionality. Again, first and foremost, being able to automate those intercompany transactions across your multiple business units, while everything being in that one instance in Business Central, not having to switch back and forth, but having those due tos and due from accounts set up and automatically balanced in the case where there's an intercompany allocation that needs to take place, or in the case of an arm's length transaction, having those accounts automatically balanced on both sides of the transaction just by inputting it once within Business Central is a major advantage we see, and a major selling point that we see our prospects getting really excited about. And then the ability to be able to maintain that organizational structure along the way, while being able to handle everything, all your master records, all within one set of master records, rather than have that, segregated between companies in Business Central. That's, again, a major advantage to not have to maintain that in multiple areas within your ERP environment, and have that in one centralized location. Can be a huge time saver, as well as just a simpler and less error prone. And then, of course, being able to manage the security role as well, to make sure that any entities that need to be accessed by only a select few users, those users who are authorized to access that, those are the only ones who are given access or given access to post within those entities. So that's still something that we're able to maintain, although everything's in one centralized location, one centralized company. You are able to lock that down based on your organizational needs. And then looking at a bit of just a very simplified view of the architecture and how that differs from baseline Business Central on the left there with multiple companies and having to consolidate those either externally or within another business unit, Business Central. Having that segregated reporting structure and having to manually manipulate that to come up with your consolidated reports there on the top. And then again, having your list, having to maintain those within those separate companies can be a major pain for Business Central users. On the right, the proposed solution with MEM, having everything in that centralized database or centralized instance, I should say, and being able to run those consolidated reports really quickly by just picking and choosing exactly which entities you'd like to include in those reports, whether it be all of them or a subset, and having that reporting capability at your fingertips without the need to have separate spreadsheets or have some other reporting tool have to consolidate those for you. And then some of the common pain points we just wanted to go through, that we hear on a regular basis that really give us a good indication that MEM could be of real value to those users. First and foremost, consolidated reporting, we've harped on it already a little bit. You can imagine how painful it is, and I'm sure you've all seen it, having to extract those reports from each individual company and then having to manually manipulate those to get to exactly which consolidated report you're looking for, and just how time consuming that can be as well with more manual processes there are in that reporting process. The more error prone it could be, and the more you'll find some inconsistencies in your reporting. And then cumbersome intercompany transactions, just having to maintain both sides of that transaction within the separate companies. Again, same values there, more time consuming, can lead to more errors along the way, and just it can be a major advantage to not have to spend time on those tedious tasks that really don't provide value to your company. They're more just inefficient process of managing those without MEM. Duplicating records between companies, having to maintain those lists of vendors, items, customers, even though maybe all of your entities you're using the same list, but you're still having to go in and manually maintain those, making sure that those are up to date and accurate. Again, just reducing that time that's spent on really non-value added activities by your accounting staff. A concern when consolidating your entities within that one instance of Business Central, but rest assured that's no problem, and Jerry will definitely take you through exactly how that can be configured in the demo portion as well. Another thing she'll go through is just how easy it is to add legal entities and be able to scale, whether it be a franchisee relationship and you're constantly adding more and more locations along the way, or you're forming a new entity for your company, being able to add that within your ERP platform, really with just a few simple configuration processes and being able to set that up very quickly and have that already in your consolidated instance. And then finally, just day-to-day processes. Whether you have a centralized payable structure or have a need to allocate common expenses across entities, MEM can help you configure, your preset allocations or have those relationships predetermined for those recurring transactions that, really are quite simple doing month to month, but can take some time in that posting process without those predetermined allocations. Getting into some of the processes and just how they can be simplified so drastically with MEM. You'll see here in the consolidated reporting process, the ability to cut out a vast majority of the manual heavy lifting and having to create a consolidated company and manage those reports and make sure that they're all input correctly and that any adjusting entries are taken into effect. Basically, we're taking all that heavy lifting out and being able to, as long as your transactions are up to date and posted within Business Central, being able to just select those company filters on the reporting tool and being able to pretty much instantly access those reports is pretty crazy. It's great functionality and something that we see really all of our users getting benefit out of. And likewise with the invoice allocation. So this again is really the other major selling point. And you'll see, in those middle processes on the top part with just native Business Central, being able to cut out those, that step 6, especially with having those multiple companies and making sure that all those allocations are correctly input and correctly attributed to all those companies on both ends of the transaction. Being able to cut that out really does provide quite a bit of value and just cut out really the most time-consuming aspect of this process, and something that's usually quite prevalent within most organizations' accounting processes as well. So with that, if nobody has any questions, then we can just jump right into the demo. Pass things over to Jerry and run you through a demo.
Thanks, Nick. I've just shared my screen, so just let me know if you can see my Business Central homepage.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So now we can manage many companies inside of one single Business Central company. And the first thing I want to point out that we do have 2 restrictions. So those restrictions, as far as what companies can be included, will be that all of the companies have to have the same local currency. Of course, multi-currency transactions can still occur, but all of the companies need to be the same local currency. And then that second restriction is that all of the companies have to have the same fiscal period, same fiscal year end. So when that's true, excuse me, then you can manage as many companies as you like inside of one Business Central company. If there are companies that don't fall under those requirements and they have a different local currency or they have a different fiscal year end, they'll still need to be set up as their own Business Central company. We do have a intercompany bridge product, which is within our Dynamics GP for MEM. And that is actually in development right now to come out in Business Central at a future date. And that's going to then give you the ability, when you do have those companies that have a different local currency or different fiscal year end, to be able to do those intercompany transactions the same way that I'm going to be showing you today. So that's coming up in the future. What I'm going to go through today is just an overview of kind of the structure, what those sort of main concepts of MEM within Business Central are going to look like. Then we'll take a look at some transactions, primarily in the case of intercompany transactions, to show you how we can work with multiple companies, even within one single transaction, and then wrap it up with reporting to show you both consolidated reporting and how you can maintain separate company reports very easily just by selecting what companies that you want to be including. And so now that we have the MEM extension installed, it's going to be layered throughout Business Central so that every single window or report we look at today is going to have a MEM component involved in it. And that goes across all your modules, the finance modules, purchasing and sales and inventory, fixed assets, jobs, manufacturing, and services. And then just coming up again a little bit later this year will be the advanced warehousing will be MEM enabled as well. So let's start with the companies. How do we create our multiple companies? And I'm going to start with the dimensions. So that's sort of the structure of MEM. What MEM is built on is the power of Business Central dimensions. And so that's how we're creating our company. And I can come in here to the MEM entity setup, and I'm going to be opening the business. This is actually Business Central dimension window where I've already created my company dimensions. So in here, I've got 10 different companies. I've got a code, I've got my description, and that's now, these values now represent my companies. So is why we can have as many companies as we need, because we're using the dimension functionality and we're using the global dimension. So it has to be either global dimension 1 or global dimension 2. It doesn't matter which one, but it will be one of those 2 global dimensions. And here's where scalability comes into play and becomes really powerful, because we use these dimensions. If one of your clients is expanding their business and acquire a new company, they'll simply put a code in here, put the description, And that's how easy it is to add a new company. There's a little bit of configuration they might need, and that varies depending on the client's business requirements, how much extra security they might want to establish, or how much extra fine tuning they need to do between their companies. But for all intent and purpose, you create a dimension value, that's your company in a way you could go. You could enter transactions just from there. So within the dimension window, we've got a MEM entity setup window as well. So this is going to be the company setup per se for each of these dimension values. And in here is where you'll put in the legal name, federal ID number. If they want to have a logo, so that different companies have a different logo, and those logos need to be printed on reports, whether it's a sales invoice or a purchase order they're sending out, you can attach that logo here and then it will populate on the reports. So in addition, you're going to put in, so for each dimension value, it now represents the company, putting in the billing information. If there's different shipping information, you can add that here. And there's a little bit more defaults and fine tuning you can do, such as payments. So bank accounts are assigned company ownership, and you can have as many bank accounts as you like, but you might want to put the default here. So if that's the case, you can put a default, and whenever there's a payment being generated or a cash receipt being added, it's going to default to this bank account. So it just makes data entry a little bit easier. Could always override it. And then we've also added a number series. So if you wanted to, for each module, you needed to have a different, or wanted to have a different number series, just make it easier that each company has its own unique number series. It makes it really easy to see at a glance by that document number which company it belongs to, or reporting. You can set it up for the different document types within the sales series, purchase, service, manufacturing, and so on. And then here, intercompany information. So we're going to take a look at how to do allocations to multiple companies on a single transaction. That's one way of doing intercompany. But a second way might be an arm's length transaction, where you're going to create the actual sales invoice and the purchase invoice between the two companies. So they have their own transaction on the subledger. And we have some support to automate that process, where if you're creating a sales order on one side for one company, it'll automatically create the purchase order for the other company. So it makes it simpler, so you don't have to enter both transactions. You'll just enter the one transaction, it'll create the opposing transaction in the other company. And so what we've done is said, whenever you're going to assign the intercompany customer and vendor and location, so that when that happens and those intercompany customers or vendors are used, it knows that it's going to create that opposing transaction, and you'll have those set up on a company by company basis, just to streamline that process. So Nick had mentioned, these are values now represent our companies, but in some cases they're going to be legal entities, but they could also be a combination of legal entities and either a division or a profit center or a franchise. Like I said, if you need to have financial reporting at that level, say for a profit center, you could have that identified as a dimension value here, and then it just rolls up for financials on the statements. So now that we have our company set up, we can see here that I've identified global dimension 1 is going to be for my company dimension value. So that now is locked in, so that every single transaction is going to have that company code on the header and the line, and this dimension value can only be used for the purposes of company with MEM now that we've locked that in. The second set here, now that we've got our company set up, is to talk about security, and this is where data governance comes into play. Who's going to have access to which data? So we're going to have security at the user level and at the master record level, because now we only have one set of master records to be shared or not shared across the companies, depending on what the business requirements are. So it makes it really easy to eliminate data redundancies, where if you have a vendor that's shared across multiple companies, you don't have to set up that vendor multiple times. You'll set up the vendor once, makes it easy if there's any changes to their contact or address, and then you can choose to either leave that vendor open and be used with all companies, or restricted, and you can specify which companies can have access to that vendor. A little bit more fine tuning can be done here. You can do decentralized or decentralized purchases or payables and cash receipts, and you can set that up as a default. There's also the ability to have additional intercompany dimensions. So if we're creating due to and due from transactions, that's fine between companies, but is there a need for additional levels of due to and due from? Like maybe there's some fund accounting or a project code that you want to create a second or a third level of due tos and due froms when transactions occur between the companies. We can add those as well. So that's the basic setup that's done as a starting point from the company and assigning that global dimension. There's a little bit more configuration we can do, and I'm not going to go through all of this today. I'm really going to focus on the security and the intercompany aspect. And so I mentioned there's data governance. Who's going to have access to the data? And the first level of this is user security. This is the Business Central users. So we'll define which users have access to which companies, because not always will they have access across the board. So if I use myself as an example, you can see here's our company values here. And I've actually only marked access to 6 companies, and I've left 6, 7, 8, and 9 unchecked. And what that means is for me as a user, even though in Business Central, I'm a super user and administrator on the account, I would only have access to these companies that are marked here. So I do this for demonstration purpose. So as we go throughout today, you'll see how that security comes into play. So as a user, I'm not going to even realize these other companies exist. So I can't enter transactions or generate reports unless I have access to a company. There's an, excuse me, there's an import function here. So getting started, if there's a lot of users and company values, you can bring that in for your clients really easily. And so that's step one of how do you have access to data, the user access. And the second level is master record security. So companies, users have permissions to companies, and then companies have permissions to master records. So these are the master records that you can share or not share. So like I said, it's optional. It can be left wide open. All companies can see the master record, or we can get really granular, like the example I gave with the vendor, where in this case, here's my full master list of vendor records, and my head office has access to all of them. But I might have company 400 has a much more limited vendor list, where these vendors that are checked here, just 3, are all they're going to be able to see when a user's entering a transaction for this company. This is the only vendors that'll show in that drop-down list. Once again, to make it easier, there's an import option. So for getting started and set up, that can be easily managed. And then going forward, when you're adding a new vendor, this access and permissions is on the vendor card. So you don't have to come back to a setup window. It makes it a little bit easier just to be able to do it on the fly. So companies are set up, our security's in place, who can access what. Now I'm going to talk about the intercompany side of things and due to and due froms that will occur, because we're using one Business Central company and the dimension functionality. So we're going to determine when a transaction is allocated between companies, where do those due tos and due froms come from? And the MEM business logic is going to handle this automatically on a transaction. And so if I use an example of all of our different companies, we can then put in both the AP and the AR for both the originating and the destination companies. So now when a transaction occurs between these 2 companies, MEM business logic is automatically going to insert those distribution lines and put in the due to and the due from on the transaction. So a user never has to do anything. This is all going to be handled. And so a transaction will be in balance between both companies in this case on that single transaction, which we'll see in just a moment. Again, there's another import. This I think is really important, especially if there's a lot of companies and different due to and due from accounts, to make sure you have that set up perhaps on your spreadsheet, make sure it all makes sense, and then go ahead and import it, because once it's done, this is really, you set this up and you don't have to look at it again unless you're adding a new company and you want to create those relationships between different companies you may transact with. So the last thing I want to show on this setup is the organizational structure, because it sort of is the next step a little bit deeper on the intercompany due tos and due froms. So this just is like additional fine tuning and configuration that a company may need. And in this case, This is where we can say that, we've set up our due tos and due froms, but there are rules as to what happens, whether a company can have intercompany transactions and create those due to and due from. An example of that could be, a few things. It might be that here we've got an example. You can see I've got almost like a parent and then an indentation here on these companies. And so I can put different rules in place, and I could say perhaps company 4 and 5 are actually a profit share, a division of company 300. So whenever I do transactions here between these three companies, I don't want to create any due to and due from. So I can still do those transactions, but I don't need due to, due from distributions. And so I can disable intercompany between any of the companies I've got set here. Or it might be another case of, well, this is actually a roll up of a parent and child. They're all their own separate intercompanies, but maybe I want that intercompany, anytime one of the companies transacts between them, I want the intercompany transactions to flow through company 700. So that's going to be the parent. So you can have multiple levels of intercompany. Sometimes it rolls up to like a parent, and then that they have a second set of due to and due from that occurs between a holding company. And so you want multiple sets that occur as how that flows through. So there's different rules you can put in place for this. Is the next level of, well, we've said we're going to do intercompany due tos and due froms, but now I'm going to be more specific and say exactly how that's going to work and flow. Not all the time does that happen. A lot of the times they have just a flat organizational structure, and it's just straight rules. Due to and due from occur based on the setup that we saw in that first window. So that's everything from a setup standpoint. So I'll go into a transaction, and so you can see how this works kind of behind the scenes. And I'll use a purchase invoice. It's just a really easy starting point. And when I come into the purchase invoice window, this is the standard list page. So we're never going to different windows. They're always the standard Business Central window. There's not a separate MEM window, but we've added MEM components to it. So here we have the company code is now shown here, so you can easily see which company a transaction belongs to, and security is in place. So I'm not going to see any transactions for companies 6, 7, 8, and 9 if there were some, which there are, but because I don't have that access, they're not shown here. So here's where it becomes really easy now from a user standpoint to be able to work with all of their companies in this single page. So when they're creating a transaction, they're going to come in and say, which company does the transaction belong to? So now you don't have to be working only on certain sets of, say, purchase invoices on a company by company basis. You can be working with all of them companies at the same time, just switching by selecting on the transaction. So I only have access to these companies. I'll select the company the transaction belongs to, and then away I'll go. And so when I come into the purchase invoice window, again, exactly the same, all standard Business Central here, but here's where we've added our MEM fields. Every single transaction window is going to have a company on the header, and it's also going to have a company on the line. So this determines which company owns the transaction. On a purchase invoice, it determines the AP control account or liability account. It determines that it's going to reside on head office subledger. The line level is where we determine, where this gets hit on the P&L. Which company is going to actually carry that expense side of things. So in this case, this is, most of the time the header and the line are going to be the same company. It's a single company transaction. But what if we want to allocate this expense? So I can select a different company on the line level, and as soon as I've done that, this becomes an intercompany transaction. I need to due to and due from because I'm allocating to another company. So when I do that and I come in and look at the posting, instead of it just being a debit to expense and a credit to the AP liability, I've now got 4-line distribution. So if we look here, here's the company code on the GL entry. This determines which financials this particular line is hitting. So company 100 is getting the expense. My head office has the liability. It's the AP control account. They're probably the one paying the bill, but they don't have to be. But my due tos and due from are happening automatically. So you can see that both companies are going to be in balance when I post this transaction. So you never have to go anywhere else to post the other side of the transaction. It cannot be out of balance between companies. So there's never any reconciling to do. So that Saves a lot of time at month end. If anything had been missed, it cannot be missed in this way. So that's really easy for a single line. And if there were other companies to allocate to, you could put company 200 on the next line, company 300, and so on. But sometimes we have where, because we can work with all of our companies on the single transaction, sometimes there's allocations that are, predefined percentages that are going to be used. And it's a common percentage where that same breakdown occurs all the time. Maybe it's month end and there's shared services or management fees that need to be allocated, and so we've created an allocation template. You can have as many templates as you like, and that sort of predefines what those allocation percentages are going to look like. So if I use this one, the insurance allocation, I can come in and take a look at what I've already set up. So I'm pulling it into the transaction, and every time I use this, I've said I want the allocations to go across these companies by these percentages, and I can even add additional dimension values. So if I want to be tracking department, I can predefine that so it defaults on the transaction, and I'm only tracking department for my one company. So now when I come in and take a look at this on the distribution, let me just make this easier here. And so it's easier to look at. When I come in and take a look at the posting, now I've got an 18-line distribution, so I don't have to go in and manually enter all those lines of allocation. If it's that template you want to use, now you can see I've got my head office has this allocation with the department already included. And then each company with its own set of due to and due froms are allocated on this single transaction. So it takes, what could be a complicated transaction with a lot of entry and makes it really simple using that template. And there you can see my liability is there. So this is a really powerful option to use this template. You can use it on any of the journals, whether it's purchase or sales or even inventory or general journal. All of it is available there. Like I said, you can have as many of them set up as you like, just to really streamline that process and entries. So what I'm showing you here, the functionality of the company on the header, the company on the line, what we're looking at is the same across any of your transaction windows. All of this process will be the same. That's the fundamentals of MEM. Which company owns the transaction? Is it a single company transaction? And if not, MEM Business Logic is going to insert those due tos and due froms automatically. When you use a template, just makes it easier to allocate to multiple companies at the same time. So that's the purchase invoice. Another really great example of how to work with multiple companies is along the same lines on the purchasing module, and it's the payment journal. So within the payment journal, we could do either centralized or decentralized payments. So the centralized being one company's bank account is going to make payments on behalf of other companies. So each company has its own subledger of purchase transactions, but everything gets paid out of a centralized bank. Or if it's decentralized, each company has their own bank accounts, they pay their own bills. There's no due to and due froms that occur. So in here, we can do all of that within one single batch if you want to, just to really streamline and show you how simple this could be to work with all of those companies. I'll go into suggest vendor payments, and I'm going to look at first a centralized batch. So all of the filters here, your standard filters for making that selection. This decentralized is a MEM button, and I've got it turned off right now. And so within that, I can say, these are the companies I want to include in this payment batch. I select any combination of I want, whatever that needs to look like. I could do all, but let me just select 3 companies here. And so when I'm just going to say okay with the options I have, and when this comes up, it's going to take a look at each individual company, what payment requirements are fitting those filters. And here you can see there's the company code. So each line represents each individual company's subledger. If I come over here, you can see I'm actually sharing this vendor across the 3 companies because I'm pulling that in for each company individually. But when we come over here, you can see this is my bank account. We're paying everything out of one single bank account. So because this bank account is owned by the head office company, there will be no due to and due from on these lines. But these lines, because these payments belong to company 2 and company 1 subledger is going to create a due to and due from automatically, because there is a cash loan that's happening in this particular case. But the beauty of this is now you can do this and send out one single payment if you want that covers more than one company. So that's on our centralized processing. We can do the same thing in decentralized by simply checking that box that I showed you as decentralized. And I already set up a batch to do that. And so in this case, I made selections saying, when I went into the prepare and suggest vendor payments, it was decentralized when I set this up, and I included companies 3, 4, and 5. And so now when we look at that, we can see 3, 4, and 5. We even share the vendor. Fabricam is listed there for company 3 and company 5. But when we come over and take a look at the bank account, it's the bank account that is owned by each individual company. So this becomes really powerful if it's an AP manager that is, centralized financial services, where she or he takes care of the payments for all the different companies, can be handled in this one single batch. When it comes time to print, if it was actually printing on check stock, then the standard Business Central functionality kind of takes over, and it's going to say, well, almost like a batch printing on the printing process, this is the payment check bank account that's being printed now, then it'll go to this one and you'll get those alerts. But if you're using blank check stock and MICR printing, then it's going to automatically print the bank details on those checks. And if you're generating an EFT file, it's going to create a separate file for each one of these accounts. So that's kind of the two best examples to give you that idea of how you can work with multiple companies in a single transaction, how those due tos and froms are going to be happening automatically. And so because we're getting up close on the hour, I want to show you the reporting and how easy it is to get that sort of overview of corporate performance on a single report. And so we'll take a look. I'm going to show you the subledger first, because we were just looking at purchasing, and then I'll show you like balance sheet and income statement. So let's do vendor trial balance. So what we have is all of these reports, out of the box Business Central reports, have been MEM enabled. And what that means is we're just taking the standard report and adding that MEM layer of security to it so that a user can only print reports for companies they have access to. So this is still the standard SSRS report that you can modify as you need. And what we've got here is, I'll show you the summary trial balance. So in this case, when it says just trial balance, that's going to be a consolidated report. Whereas we see by entity, that's going to give me the ability to print for all of the companies I want, have a separate report, but generate it all in one selection process. So I'll show you both. And if we take a look at trial balance, this is going to give us a consolidated single page report, if it falls onto a single page, for any combination of companies that we want to be including here, just by selecting them. So I could say, well, in this case, I need to see consolidated for these 3 companies. Or maybe I want to select them all. Say I want to consolidate a report for all of my companies. Let's say it's based on Fabricam that we knew is a shared vendor, and I'll just put in a date filter here. Standard ability to send to Excel, Word, PDF, or the scheduler. But if we preview this, when this comes up, the report is always going to show me which companies are going to be included on the report. And then in this case, this is a consolidated report for Fabricam. Grand total owing across all of these companies. So now, instead of having to take that information individually from each company and then compile it together and merge all the data together, it just takes a few seconds. You pull up the companies you want. You now have that consolidated report. So this gives you that visual into your overall spend with Fabricam, and maybe the ability to do negotiations with them a little bit easier. So now if I do the same thing, but now I go, well, it's actually month end, and I need an individual trial balance per company for my month end working papers. So now I'll select trial balance by entity. So now this makes it a lot easier. Instead of having to go and select each company report to print, once again, I just include any of the companies I want at this point. If I leave it blank, it'll automatically give me all of my companies, and I'll make that same selection for Fabricam and for that date filter. So now when this comes up, you can see all the same information up here, but now it's giving me a report by a company. So this is my head office. This is the balance for Fabricam with the head office. Next page is going to be company 100, different totals, of course, company 200, 300, all the way to the end. And then it even gives me the total, so I can see the total for all of the vendors. So now I have these reports either individually. It makes it so much easier. Just select those companies. I get them all at the same time available for printing, or that consolidated total where it's that single page. So this is on the subledger, but the same thing occurs, you know, whether it's a balance sheet or an income statement or the account schedules. You're going to, let's see here. You're going to have the option to print either consolidated or individual company reports, the same thing that we just did a moment ago, selecting which companies you want to include. And when this comes up, I've got a consolidated report for all the companies that I have access to. Even though I left it blank, it only gives me those 6. And then I've got my consolidated balance sheet. So that's the out of the box reporting. You know, if your clients are using any kind of advanced reporting, whether it's Jet Reports or Power BI or Solver, that's totally fine because MEM is built on that global dimension. So we work perfectly well with all of those advanced reporting tools. So that's kind of my high level overview of, you know, how to streamline those processes and make that ability to work with multiple companies so much more efficient, more accurate, you know, gaining better productivity, and to be able to get that really easy view on your consolidated reporting. So hopefully that's given you, you know, what you were looking for and answered any questions that you might have.
Paul or Allie, do you guys have any questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have any questions either.
Great.
Okay, great.